Do you feel that LNG is going to get wrapped into the trade war between China and the U.S.?
Well, I think China has a lot of incentive to stay with the U.S. LNG market. You know, the U.S. LNG is probably going to reach 10 billion cubic feet per day by the end of this decade, third largest in the world. And certainly China has access to others, Australia, Qatar, but they like diversity. So I think they may continue this exemption, if you like, for liquefied gas.
We've seen some rumblings, though, already at the conference of CEOs of natural gas companies that are looking to secure long-term contracts, and they're saying that buyers are now a little bit skittish, and everyone is going to China to get those long-term contracts. If there's a waiver, if there's a fallout of any capacity, can we build out our export terminals? Can we build out our pipelines? We are already building a number of export facilities for this decade. I think the real issue is what's sometimes called the second wave of LNG facilities, 2022, 2023, et cetera. And their long-term contracts obviously provide a lot of support for financing and the like. But, you know, in the end, I think that the dynamics remain that LNG is going to grow dramatically. There's going to be a large market. So I can understand, obviously, the uncertainties right now. I have a hard time seeing that these won't get worked out in time, certainly for this second wave of LNG exports. I want to move to another area that's really in the market when it comes to power and the Department of Energy, and that is the third attempt by the administration to help subsidize coal and nuclear plants in the Northeast, particularly asking the power supplier to buy power from plants that maybe should be closing. If President Obama came to you and said, do this, how would you do it? What would you do?
Well, first of all, my advice would be to not basically completely contradict the market principles that have guided our whole approach to energy in this country. I think the way to look at it is that if you're going to do public policy, public regulation to support energy, you need a public good to do it. You know, what's the benefit to the public? For nuclear power, clearly there is no carbon. There are national security imperatives. Frankly, the case has not been made based upon things like fuel supply, resilience. Our resilience, the NERC, the North American Energy Reliability Council, has just said recently that our resilience is increasing. So frankly, I just don't see the arguments, and I think up to now, neither has the Regulatory Commission, neither has a bipartisan set of energy experts.
When I do talk to some investors, though, as well as some individuals related to the industry, they do tend to say that there are issues. It may not be the issues the administration is pointing out. The subsidies may not be the good option, but maybe transmission has a risk. Perhaps natural gas pipeline security does have a risk. Where do you see the risk?
Yeah, so in fact, if you look at reliability resilience issues in the electricity sector, it's mainly connected with the wires, with transmission and sometimes distribution systems in big storms. That's where it is. And so continuing to include a lot more information technology, sensors, et cetera, in the transmission and distribution system, I think makes a lot of sense. And we have a long way to go also to value things like various services like keeping frequency and voltage stable, et cetera, in the system. That's where the focus is. Frankly, I'm hard pressed to see where the supply side has been the problem with resilience. In fact, if I may just add,
please.
One talks about, you know, they're trying to advocate fuel storage as an issue as though natural gas has been a major supply problem. It hasn't been a major supply problem. And in New England, when we had a shortage of gas in February in a cold spell, it wasn't because of the transmission system not operating. It's because, in my view, counter to sensible planning, New England has declined to increase its import capacity from Pennsylvania. And then what the system did is it used oil as a substitute fuel for gas for a short time in power plants. So we have a pretty resilient system. I don't want to be too Pollyannish. I mean, we need to keep working at it. And certainly, as I say, integrating the system with information technology, smart systems. But I just don't see the arguments being used by the administration administration as having any convincing basis.
So let's move to your third part, which is the nuclear initiative and your role in that. And I wanted to get your thoughts on Iran and President Trump walking away from the Iran deal. European Union is really stuck in the middle because their companies operate there and they want to keep that revenue, but they don't want to upset the U.S. They don't want to get cut off from the dollar payment system. What do you think that Europe winds up doing?
Well, Europe is working very hard, and frankly was working very hard before the president's announcement, which I believe was a terrible strategic mistake. So I think an issue is going to be, can the Europeans, and don't forget Russia and China, can they work together to support things like oil sales from Iran, which actually is the main revenue generator following the agreement. I think maybe some of the smaller enterprises in Europe might be shielded from sanctions. But the reality is, first of all, we're still waiting to understand how Treasury is going to impose the sanctions. But if it's a blunt instrument in terms of American secondary sanctions, what you implied is absolutely right. The multinational companies will have no choice other than to stop operating in Iran. It
feels like some of the data that we're getting is that it's going to be a lot harsher than it was under President Obama, in that Japan's already been asked to stop buying Iranian crude at all, so not a reduction, but buying stop altogether. What are you hearing?
I'm hearing that there's a lot of resistance to that, and secondly, I would add that China is the biggest customer, and I don't think China, maybe not unconnected to your first question about trade issues, I don't think China will be too interested in zeroing out Iranian oil imports. That will be a critical issue, how China, India, Japan respond. I note that during the Obama administration, the sanctions were very effective, and they were very effective because we had the cooperation of countries, and not only our allies, in terms of reducing Iranian oil imports and withholding the funds. Right now, we have obviously split the alliance. We are not on particularly good terms with Russia. We have trade issues with China right now. I don't think that while the sanctions may be somewhat effective, we're not going to have the cooperation we had before. I might add one other thing that we haven't mentioned, and that is in pulling out of the agreement, what the president has jeopardized is the world's strongest verification regime. And verification is the key to the Iranian agreement. I will note that he's going to be hard-pressed to top that, and he must, in a Korean agreement.